All right, so we were just talking about the needs for appropriate stimuli or cues to help us to retrieve information. So I wanted to demonstrate that with you. So I'm going to say a word, a stimulus term, and then I'll say whether I want your first, second, or third associate. Your job is to generate associates that go with that stimulus term and then write down the one that I've asked for, right, on your piece of paper. So, for example, if I say as the stimulus term, I want you to think of a city in Ohio, and then I say I want your third associate. Let's say, for example, that in your mind you thought, well, let's see what cities are in Ohio. And the first one that comes to mind is Cleveland. And then let's say Cincinnati comes to mind second. And then you think of Columbus. What I would want you to write down is Columbus because I asked for that third associate. So it's going to be a little bit of labor intensiveness going on through here because you may or may not be that familiar. Like you may not know any cities in Ohio, which is fine. I mean, you can write down, if you've sat there and thought and you really can come up with two, you can just sort of write down, the second one if you had to, because you can't think of another one. That's fine. It's normal to not know all of the things that I'm going to say. So don't feel pressured. But what I do want you to do is write down your response. And so you're going to probably want to have your finger on the pause button. And as I give you the prompt, hit pause, think about it, write down what's appropriate, then hit go again so that you can kind of have time to think about the response. I'm going to go kind of quickly just in case some of you are just watching this and not really doing it. All right. So the first stimulus term is precious stone, and I want you to think of your first associate. The second stimulus term is fish, and I want you to think of your second associate with the word fish. State, third. Insect, second. Type of music, first. Alcoholic beverage, third. Color, second. Military title, third. Article of clothing, first. Sport, second. Musical instrument, first. Four-footed animal, third. Occupation, first. Weapon, third. Piece of furniture, second. Type of fuel, second. Disease, first. Vegetable, third. Type of vehicle, second. And part of human body, first. So if you need to pause me again right now and make sure that you've got all of your associations written down, go ahead and do that. All right, I'm going to assume you're all back or we're just watching. Now, what I want you to do is fold that paper, set it aside, write on it the word cue, because we're going to come back to that later in this chapter's set of lectures, and we'll move on with that, and you'll see why that was important later. All right. I embedded it here because it kind of illustrates that example of, the importance of cues, right? Like I gave you cues to try and retrieve from your memory examples of those different stimuli. So it's a good example of what we mean by that. All right, so we're back to what we were talking about, motivated forgetting, and we already talked about repression, where you place painful information into your unconscious. I've got a nice picture of Freud's topographical model saying that, you've got this conscious part of your mind that's above the waterline and accessible, and then you've got all this unconscious underneath. This is Freud's model. This does not necessarily mean this is what all psychologists think. Retrieval inhibition. This is actually what I studied for my dissertation. And I put a toilet here because retrieval inhibition is often displayed by students who, on the start of a new term, it's almost like they have flushed everything they learned last term so they can start with a clean bowl, right? We block retrieval of information that we think is no longer needed. And that allows us to feel like we are not going to experience any kind of interference from that old information while we're trying to learn new information. A lot of us walk around with the misapprehension that our memories will get full, that we're going to ultimately run out of space. So we kind of have to shove old stuff that we don't need anymore into this inaccessible state so we can use our memory for new stuff. Kind of like if you've ever done a cleanup on your, disk cleanup on your computer, where you're trying to defrag all your information and get it all squished up next to each other so that you have more space. It's kind of like that. It's kind of a faulty logic that we all carry around, though, because first off, your memory's not going to fill up. You hopefully are aware now that memories form when new synapses develop between neurons. And so you have an infinite capability to grow new synapses. You don't have to delete an old memory to make room for a new one. So hopefully you guys realize that. Now, the risk of interference is a good one. And so we'll talk about that more. But this idea that you can kind of block retrieval of old information so that it won't interfere is kind of, again, faulty logic, because the effort that it takes to suppress that old information actually interferes with the cognitive capability that it would take to process the new information. So you're actually weakening your likelihood of producing good responses when you try and inhibit retrieval. But people do it all the time. We try to put things out of our minds. So that would be an example of motivated forgetting. And then the last thing is the Pollyanna Principle. And this says that pleasant items tend to be recalled before unpleasant ones. And it's called the Pollyanna Principle after a character in a book that I have to confess I've never read. It's a really old, like 1800s novel, and those are hard to read, really, honestly. But if you've read it, you know who Pollyanna is. Apparently, Pollyanna always saw the bright side on everything, which is great. It's great to be an optimist, right? But you don't want to be an optimist to the point where you're denying reality, right? You don't want to be such an optimist that you don't get, that lump checked out by the doctor or something like that. Oh, I'm sure it's fine. It'll just go away. Pollyanna is like optimism piled on with denial, right? This whole like just act like everything's fine kind of attitude. We call it the Pollyanna Principle because all of us who are not clinically depressed, all of us tend to recall much more easily positive memories. People who are clinically depressed actually have the reverse pattern, but people who are not tend to focus on the positive. And so one theory on that is that we're sort of motivated to forget the negative things that have happened in our life. It helps to maintain our positive moods, right? So if we can kind of look back on the past with what we like to call rosy retrospection, right? We look back through sort of rose-colored glasses and we only really remember the good things. I mean, even a negative story oftentimes ends up with a funny twist or a happy ending in the long run, or, really, in fact, I'm kind of glad that happened kind of finding. So that tendency towards positivity is a good example of motivated forgetting. Like I don't want to be bogged down with the negativity. I want to be focusing on the positive. Blocking. Okay. So sticking with blocking, so we have motivated forgetting, but we also do have interference that can occur in our memories. So when you're trying to retrieve information, incorrect information may offer itself. So one example of interference would be what we call proactive interference. And this is where the old information that you have really well encoded, that is just, so well known that you can say it without even thinking. Like, let's say your phone number. Maybe your phone number from when you were younger and used to have to tell people your phone number all the time, right? Not just sort of, here, let me text you real quick, and now we both have each other's numbers. That number that you have super well encoded may interfere with your ability to encode a new number. And I put in an appropriate phone that would be your transition from a landline to a cell phone. It's appropriately old to represent that having happened. But so that old number that you have really super well encoded, but it is not what you want to be retrieving right now. You want to be retrieving your new number. That really well encoded one says, but I'm your phone number. Why would you say anything else? I'm your phone number. And it offers itself. It interferes with your retrieval of the newer information. So we call this proactive because the old information is moving forward, right? It's blocking the newer thing. Old information is leaping across and offering itself instead of the newer information. Retroactive interference occurs when you have newer information that is so well learned and so well rehearsed that it actually has become automatic, and you can produce it without even thinking about it. So now if you're asked, for example, now that you've really well encoded your cell phone number and this is your phone number and you're completely used to doing that, if you're asked, what was your number before? Like, what used to be your old number? You may not be able to retrieve that old number, even though maybe it was your phone number. Like my childhood, it was my phone number for 20 years. It was the only phone number I knew for the first 20 years of my life. Get a new phone number, and then suddenly you're like, what is that old number? I finally have learned my new phone number well enough that I can say it without having to think about it. And you ask me what my old phone number was? I can't remember, right? Like it's blocked for a second because that new information is working retroactively, moving backwards to block access to the old information that is no longer the relevant information. I have finally convinced my brain that the new information is what I need. So my brain is going to say, okay, well, don't offer that old phone number. She gets mad every time I do anyway. So don't offer that. Offer the new phone number. Even when the question is, what is your old phone number? I've experienced this with filling out like applications for things, and it'll ask for your previous addresses. And I don't even remember what I was applying for that was asking way back in the past. It wanted to know where I had lived when I was in graduate school. And, I had lived at that address for 4 years, and it was my address. So of course I know it. And I'm like, what was that street name? I can't even remember the street name, let alone the zip code or the actual number on the street. Like, I know the city and the state. Like, I've really repressed this. It's being interfered with by the new information. And in that case, like 5 subsequent addresses that I had lived. It was really surprising that I couldn't, and then when I said to my husband, what was our address? He was able to generate the first digit of our street address, and that kind of kickstarted me. And I go, oh, I remember the street. I got the street. Okay, I've got the street. But it was the craziest experience. And I'll bet most of you have had something like that, where maybe it was your school locker and you finally memorize your school locker code. In my olden times, they actually had the what is that called when it's not a padlock. It's a lock that's actually embedded in the, combination lock embedded in the locker. And so every year you would get your little locker number card, and you'd first have to find your locker, and then you'd have to sit there and memorize the thing. It would take weeks into the new school year for you to learn your combination. And then next year comes along, you get your new card. They can never give you the same locker twice. I don't know what that is. I guess freshmen are over here and sophomores are over there. But anyway, so you get your new locker code, and that old one just keeps offering itself. You keep wanting to use that combination. And you have to really just sort of push through it till you can get rid of that proactive interference and switch it back into retroactive interference, so that you can make sure that the new code is the one that's popping into your head most readily. Now, let me give you a crazy example of this. Let's say that you've been dating somebody consistently for some amount of time, to the point where your association with dates is this person's name. And then you break up. And you go on your first date after the breakup, and you accidentally call your date by your previous dating partner's name. That would be a good example of proactive interference, where your old date, that name just so readily comes to mind when you're, going out to dinner, or you're going to the movies or whatever. That person's name is just associated with it, so you utter that person's name. Here's what you do. You tell that new person, you know what? It won't take long before we will completely get rid of that reaction, and we'll get retroactive interference, and I won't even remember that previous partner's name. It'll just be yours. That's romantic. Yeah, tell them that. They'll like that. Anyway. Now, retroactive interference can happen when something new interferes with what you tried to learn. And so one of the benefits of studying right before bed is that you can reduce any possible interference with other information between study time and sleep time, where those memories are really likely to be consolidated. And also, if the test is in the morning, it's really smart to study, directly sleep on it, get up and go fresh to that test, right? So that you don't get any retroactive interference. Here's an example of the results of a study that showed that, where you've got a person who studied and then remained awake for a different number of hours. So in the blue line, they stayed awake for either 1 or 2 or all the way up to 8 hours after studying. And you see that their percent of syllables recalled is much lower than people who went to sleep for either 1, 2, or up to 8 hours. Without interfering events, recall seems to be better. So if you can arrange your studying so that you can study right before bedtime when you have a big test the next day, it can really help you with memory. I want to kind of complete this one slide before we get to cue-dependent memory. So I know I'm running a little past my goal is 15 minutes per lecture, and sometimes I run over. Response competition is when you have the same cue associated with different responses. So response competition is you have, I could say this or I could say that. Sometimes when I stop talking in the middle of a lecture, it's because I'm deciding between 2 words that I'm going to say. Both of them basically mean the same thing, and I'm trying to decide which one I want to do. Sometimes when you have that kind of response competition with words, your brain will solve it by mixing them together and making what's called a Spoonerism, where you just blend the 2 words together and say nonsense. Some Spoonerisms have become actual words now. Like people have blended together gigantic and enormous to now we have the word ginormous, which didn't used to be a word. It's a Spoonerism, but it's like, actually, it's bigger than giant and it's bigger than enormous. Let's put it together and call it ginormous. Okay, let's do that. We've all agreed now it's a word. But that's a really good example. A Spoonerism is a good example of, response competition, that the solution was just blend them. But when you have, you have to actually decide between the 2 responses, it can cause interference that can then make it difficult for you to actually retrieve either one of those responses, or to produce either one of those responses smoothly as you're trying to decide, well, what should I do? Both of these are equally appropriate in this situation. So I have to figure out which one to emit, and I can't decide. So I'm just sort of blocked and can't produce any response. So these are our sins of omission called blocking, interference, and we have these 3 different components of interference. All right, so that's a good time to stop. Let's come back in the next segment and talk about cue-dependent forgetting.